the cold expanse of the void, where silence reigns and the faint flicker of distant stars is a reminder of the immeasurable distance between worlds, the heart of the Imperium beats, a heart protected by the indomitable forces of the Imperial Navy. A force of unrelenting discipline, unyielding power, and an unwavering devotion to the Emperor. As the shadows of war stretch further, the Imperial Navy becomes not just the shield of mankind's last bastion, but the blade that drives back the encroaching darkness, ensuring that humanity's fragile light does not fade into oblivion. But within this steel and void Leviathan, a new kind of war is being waged. A war not only fought with weapons of unimaginable power, but with willpower, strategy, and the sheer determination of those who stand watch over the Imperium's heart. What drives these men and women to risk everything, to sail into the jaws of battle, knowing full well that each mission may be their last? This is the story of those who serve aboard the ships of the Imperial Navy, where the price of failure is extinction and the reward for success is nothing less than the survival of the human race. Before we journey deeper into the void, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Imperium Unveiled, where we bring the darkest and most awe-inspiring corners of the Warhammer 40K universe to life. You won't want to miss what comes next, because the shadows of the Imperium stretch far, and there are secrets even the stars dare not reveal. The vast expanse of space is a quiet, oppressive place, one that seems to stretch on without end. The stars, twinkling lights in the infinite black, are but distant beacons, reminders of the impermanence of all things. Yet, in this never-ending void, where the cold is absolute and the silence unbearable, there lies a force, steadfast and unrelenting, that stands between humanity and total annihilation. This force is the Imperial Navy, and its purpose is clear: to protect, defend, and, if necessary, sacrifice for the survival of the Imperium. Every day, the crew of the Navy's warships wake up with one undeniable truth etched into their minds: their existence is a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. For many, their entire lives have been dedicated to this singular cause. They are not the emperors, the generals, or the highborn. They are the unsung guardians of a vast empire, stationed in ships that are both their homes and their coffins. From the moment their feet touch the cold metal floors of their vessels, they know the stakes are beyond their control, that each mission could be their last. It is not glory they seek, nor fame, but survival. Their purpose is to ensure that the light of the Imperium does not fade into the darkness of the universe. In the lower decks of a battle cruiser, far away from the deck officers and commanders, the lives of the rank-and-file sailors are shaped by routine and duty. For them, there is no distinction between the void and the ship's corridors. Both are places where death can come without warning. The low hum of the engines becomes their heartbeat, and the tight spaces between bulkheads become their sanctuary and their prison. They live in the shadow of their captains, who, from their elevated positions, command their every move, directing them to the edge of space and back again. The officers who command these great vessels have a different understanding of the war they wage. They are not naive to the fact that their ships are but instruments of a much larger war, one that spans the galaxy and is fought on the front lines of forgotten worlds and in the depths of the void. They know that their decisions are never just decisions. They are the very things that keep the Imperium alive or send it spiraling into oblivion. Every command issued from the bridge carries with it the weight of countless lives, those of their crew, those of the soldiers they deploy, and those of the civilians who remain unaware of the endless dangers encircling them. In these darkened moments, the Navy's true strength reveals itself, not in the weapons they wield or the vessels they command, but in the unspoken understanding that the protection of humanity is an eternal responsibility. And while the men and women of the Navy may never receive the recognition they deserve, it is their silent vigilance that keeps the light of Terra shining against the blackness of space. But their resolve is often tested. The Navy's purpose is not only to protect from the immediate threats that lurk on the edges of the galaxy, but to maintain a perpetual vigilance against the enemies that would tear the Imperium apart. For the Navy, every mission is a reminder of the fragility of their empire. Every battle fought, every enemy repelled, is merely a reprieve, a temporary delay in the inevitable war for survival. The threat of the Xenos, the heretics, the chaos gods, and the insidious darkness that seeks to destroy all life weighs heavily on the shoulders of those who serve. As we look deeper into the inner workings of the Navy, we see not just the ships, not just the towering forms of the mighty battle cruisers or the sleek, deadly strike craft, but the lives of those who walk the endless corridors. We see the quiet sacrifices, the grim acceptance of the burden of war. We hear the whispers in the shadows, the camaraderie and the quiet despair of men and women who understand that in the service of the Emperor, there are no guarantees. They stand ready, ever watchful, ever vigilant, and always prepared to face the darkness. It is in these quiet moments, where the soft murmur of the ship's systems hums like a lullaby against the backdrop of silence, that the weight of duty is most acutely felt. For those serving in the Imperial Navy, there is no time for dreams of peace. There are no holidays or idle moments of respite. The crew lives in constant anticipation of the next command, the next maneuver, the next battle that will test their mettle. In the galley, the sailors gather in groups, their faces lit by the dim, flickering glow of the overhead lights. They speak in low voices, sharing the stories of home they'll never return to, the families they left behind, and the distant worlds they once called their own. These moments are fleeting, for the reality of their position aboard a massive warship is all-encompassing. There is no escape from the endless expanse of the void. Outside, the stars may be beautiful, but they are also harbingers of the unknown dangers that lie in wait. A ship in the void is both a sanctuary and a prison, and those who live aboard it know it all too well. The officers above them, however, live with an even greater burden. They are not bound by the same strict routine as their subordinates. Instead, they live within the chaos of strategic decisions and the constant weight of command. For each decision, there is a cost. For every life they risk, every order they give, there is the potential for catastrophic failure. And yet, they do it without hesitation. Each officer has made peace with the fact that their duty is paramount. The Emperor demands it, and they have chosen to serve. In the command center, the bridge officers stand at their stations, their eyes fixed on the glowing data slate displays before them. The distant stars may look serene, but the data coming in from the sensor arrays tells a much darker story. Xenos fleets, unholy forces, and the ever-present shadow of chaos are never far from their thoughts. It is in this tension, this constant vigilance, that the true purpose of the Navy becomes clear. Not only are they tasked with defending humanity, but they are also the last bastion between the Imperium and the forces that seek to unmake it. When a distress signal comes through, when the first flicker of an enemy ship appears on the radar, there is no hesitation. Orders are barked out. The crew moves with precision, rehearsed through countless drills, their training kicking in with a calmness that belies the danger of the moment. The engines hum louder as they push forward, and the ships themselves seem to come alive. In response, readying for whatever threat may be coming. For those serving aboard the ships of the Imperial Navy, the concept of fear is not something to be eliminated, but something to be controlled. Fear can cripple an unprepared mind, but for those who have devoted their lives to the service of the Emperor, fear is simply another weapon to wield. It is an ever-present reminder of what they fight for, the survival of mankind. It keeps them sharp, keeps them disciplined. Without fear, there would be no need for courage. The vast expanse of space may seem endless, but in reality, the Navy is fighting against more than just the cold, indifferent void. They are fighting against an eternal, cosmic adversary, a foe that never rests, never sleeps, and never forgives. They are humanity's first and last line of defense against the chaos that seeks to destroy it, and for that reason, they are far more than mere soldiers in a war. They are the unseen guardians of the Imperium's very existence, the silent protectors who endure and persevere, even when no one is watching. And in this eternal war, there is no final victory. The war does not end with a single battle, a single victory. It continues, endlessly, forever. The stakes grow higher with each passing day, the threats more insidious, the challenges greater, but so too does the resolve of those who serve. In the heart of the Imperial Navy, there is no room for failure. The survival of the Imperium rests on their shoulders, and they will carry that weight until their final breath. The power of the Imperial Navy is not solely derived from the vastness of its ships, nor the strength of its armament, but from the very core of its leadership. The men and women who stand at the helm of these warships are more than commanders. They are the embodiment of the Imperium's will, chosen not for their prowess in battle alone, but for their unshakable devotion to the Emperor's cause. They lead not only with strategy and precision, but with an unspoken understanding of the responsibility that comes with the lives of thousands under their command. At the heart of every vessel, from the flagship to the smallest patrol craft, stands a commander who knows that their every decision will have repercussions far beyond the confines of their ship. They are the linchpins of the fleet, the quiet yet powerful forces that guide their crews through the endless dangers of space. These officers are burdened by the weight of duty, but it is a burden they have accepted with open arms. To them, there is no greater calling than to serve the Emperor, even at the cost of their own lives. Commodore Caelen stood on the bridge of the Exemplar, a massive battleship in the Imperium's war fleet. The lights flickered slightly as the ship surged through the warp, but it was a familiar, almost comforting disturbance. Caelen's fingers danced across the data slate in front of him, his eyes scanning the endless strings of information that streamed in from the crew, from the fleets they were coordinating with, and from the intelligence reports on the Xenos movements in the sector. His brow furrowed as new data appeared, enemy fleets spotted on the far edges of the sector, fast approaching the Imperial positions. The distance was still considerable, but it would close quickly. Behind him, his officers worked in silence. They had all learned that silence was often the loudest form of communication in the Navy. Each officer knew their role. Each was a master of their craft. Lieutenant Bellis, the ship's tactical officer, stood in front of her station, eyes fixed on the star map as she plotted potential courses of action. Her hands moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. No hesitation, no doubt, just pure focus. Caelen's voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "Prepare the fleet for engagement. No room for error on this one." The command was swift, and the ship's crew reacted as one. The crew knew that the Commodore's orders were final. There was no room for second-guessing. They moved through their tasks with the same disciplined efficiency as every other soldier in the Imperial Navy. The Exemplar may have been a colossal vessel, but in moments like these, it became an extension of Caelen himself. Each action, each command, felt like a pulse, vital, urgent, inevitable. But it was not just the officers who carried the weight of leadership. Below deck, in the heart of the crew, the very essence of the Navy's spirit resided in the lower ranks. A crewman in the auxiliary engineering bay, his hands covered in oil as he calibrated the reactor's flux lines, knew that his work ensured that the Exemplar would not falter when the battle came. The young ensign on the communications deck knew that his skill in maintaining the Vox Grill communications lines would ensure that the Navy's orders could be transmitted seamlessly to the fleet. Each person, no matter their role, was a part of a greater whole. A whole that depended on the discipline, unity, and unwavering loyalty of its leaders and crew. It is in these moments, when the tension is palpable and every officer is aware that the next decision could be the one that tips the scales of war, that the true cost of leadership becomes evident. Commodore Caelen's hands gripped the edge of his command station as the lights above dimmed and the distant hum of the ship's engines intensified. The stillness of the moment was broken only by the quiet commands exchanged between officers. Their mission was more than a tactical maneuver. It was the lifeblood of the Imperium. Every commander, every officer, carried within them the weight of humanity's survival. The Navy was their instrument of salvation, and they had been entrusted with the most sacred of duties, to preserve and protect mankind from the horrors of the galaxy. The officers knew that their role was far more than that of mere strategists. They were the stewards of humanity's last hope, the ones who ensured that the Emperor's light would continue to shine, even against the darkest forces. It was their responsibility to give direction, to provide the stability necessary for the Navy to function as a cohesive whole. And in their hearts, they knew that to fail in this duty was not merely a matter of personal disgrace. It was the death sentence for billions. As the Exemplar prepared to enter battle, Commodore Caelen stood resolute at the center of it all, the very embodiment of the Imperium's will. In his mind, the words of the Emperor echoed. In the light of his gaze, we shall never falter. And as the crew carried out their duties, their faith in their commander, their mission, and the Emperor gave them the strength to face the enemy with unflinching resolve. The sound of the ship's engines reverberated through the halls like the growl of a great beast in the depths of a cave. Below deck, the hum of the Exemplar's massive reactors thrummed like the beating of a heart, steady, powerful, and unyielding. Every system, every cog in the machine operated with perfect synchronization. From the crew in the lower decks, maintaining the vital systems that kept the ship functioning, to the officers standing poised on the bridge, the Exemplar was more than just a vessel. It was a symbol of the Emperor's will, a physical representation of humanity's unrelenting determination in the face of an uncaring universe. In the bowels of the ship, Chief Engineer Talos stood over a massive reactor core, his face illuminated by the faint blue glow of the plasma fusion reactors. Sweat dripped from his brow as he made adjustments, ensuring that the heart of the Exemplar pulsed with the power needed to drive them forward into battle. Talos was a man of few words, but the weight of his responsibility bore down on him in the same way it did the officers above. Without the engineers, the ship would be nothing but a hollow husk in space, unable to fight, unable to survive. It was his team that maintained the life support systems, ensured the weapons systems were ready, and kept the engines from overheating when the ship pushed itself to its limits. His hands, calloused and stained with the marks of his labor, moved methodically across the controls. In the moments before a battle, the tension within the ship's systems was palpable. Every click of a switch, every press of a button was critical. In these moments, engineers like Talos were more than technicians. They were the unsung guardians who kept the Navy's vessels alive in the void, giving the officers above the tools they needed to succeed. But it wasn't just the engineers who bore the weight of the battle. In the midst of the crew's quiet preparation, there was an undercurrent of something darker. The Navy's men and women had seen the horror of war too many times to ignore the creeping sense of dread that always lingered before a campaign. The sudden flashes of brilliance, the long silence between engagements, and the endless unknowns of the void all had their toll. There was no comfort, no time for luxury in the Navy. Every moment was lived on the edge of survival, a precarious balance between life and death. For the lower-ranking officers and non-commissioned officers, life on board was a daily test of resilience. Sergeant Solvay, stationed in the arms vault, had spent years preparing his soldiers for the horrors of combat. He had seen men break under pressure, seen the life drain from their eyes in the heat of battle. But he had also seen them rise again, stronger and more determined than ever before. The Imperial Navy demanded perfection from its soldiers. There was no room for weakness, no space for hesitation. Every soldier, from the lowliest deckhand to the highest officer, knew that they were part of something much greater than themselves. They were the shield, the sword, and the will of the Emperor. As Solvay looked over his squad, he saw a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. The same look that had crossed his own face countless times before. He had fought in campaigns where the odds were so far stacked against them that survival seemed impossible. But every time, the Navy had fought on. They had adapted, they had learned, and they had conquered. In moments like this, when the future was uncertain and the silence of space stretched out like an endless abyss, the one constant was the unwavering loyalty to the Imperium. The Navy's men and women knew the sacrifice that was demanded of them, and yet they marched to their deaths without question, without hesitation. They were not driven by a need for glory, nor by the call of victory. They were driven by the sacred duty to protect humanity. As the Exemplar prepared to move into position, the tension in the air grew thick. Every officer, every sailor, and every soldier felt the collective weight of the impending battle. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath. They were about to engage the enemy again, and the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the Navy would never falter. Above them all, Commodore Caelen surveyed the tactical display, his mind calculating the movements, the angles, and the strategies needed to overcome the looming threat. His hands gripped the rail in front of him, knuckles white as the battle plans unfolded in his mind. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him, but there was no fear, no self-doubt. He had been trained for this moment, as had his crew. They were prepared. They would fight, and they would win. Because for the Navy, the stakes were not merely strategic. They were personal. It was not just the survival of a battle they fought for. It was the survival of everything humanity held dear. The void is not empty. It never was. The vastness of space may appear to be a realm of isolation, where the stars twinkle like distant jewels in a great cosmic ocean, but the reality is far darker. Out there, in the far reaches beyond the safety of the Imperium's borders, the forces of destruction move like predators in the night, their presence felt before they are seen. The Imperial Navy does not merely guard the heart of the Imperium. It is the shield against the horrors that lurk in the darkness of space, against the Xenos, the chaos, and the ancient enemies that wait for a chance to strike. The battle cruiser Exemplar carved through the stars, its engines blazing with unyielding power as it sailed toward the enemy. Commodore Caelen stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the dark expanse before him. The reports flooding in were not encouraging. An alien fleet, one of an unknown design, was approaching. The sensors couldn't yet identify them fully, but what was clear was that they were unlike anything the Imperium had encountered before. They were fast, silent, and their movements were precise, as though they had been expecting them. The Exemplar had fought countless battles, but this was different. The unknown brought with it a sense of unease that even the most seasoned officers could not dismiss. There was no time for second-guessing, no room for doubt. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing their stations for the upcoming engagement. The ship's massive guns were loaded, the void shields flickered to life, and the fighters were deployed. They had no choice but to face what was coming, whatever it might be. The sense of unease grew with every passing moment. Lieutenant Bellis, the tactical officer, stood at her station, her eyes scanning the enemy fleet's approach. The enemy ships were silent, almost ghostly. No flicker of energy, no standard readings on their scans. It was as if they were phantoms, moving in the shadows. The Exemplar's sensors could pick up the faintest traces of energy, but nothing concrete. No matter how many times she adjusted the settings, the ships remained inscrutable. "There's something wrong," Bellis muttered under her breath, her voice tense. "They're out there, but they're not there." Caelen turned sharply, his eyes narrowed, focusing on the display before him. "What do you mean?" "There's no standard heat signature, no ion trails, no comms chatter. We should be seeing more," Bellis explained. "It's like they're made of the void itself." The Commodore's eyes flickered with understanding. The void was not a realm of peace and serenity. It was a realm of hunger, where countless predators hunted the weak and the unwary. And these enemies, whoever they were, had learned to survive within it, to become one with the darkness. "Ready the weapons," Caelen ordered, "and brace for impact." The Exemplar's engines roared to life as it surged forward, closing the distance to the enemy fleet. Every officer, every soldier aboard the vessel was acutely aware that they were not simply engaging an enemy, they were engaging the unknown. There was a primal fear in that. The unknown was unpredictable, and it was the most terrifying thing of all. What if their weapons didn't work against these foes? What if the shields failed, and they were caught in the open, vulnerable to something they didn't understand? As the fleet came within firing range, the unknown vessels shifted, moving in formations that defied all conventional tactics. They weren't just ships, they were predators, fluid and unrestrained. The Commodore's voice rang out through the command center. "Fire at will. We will break through them, no matter the cost." The Exemplar unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, its guns charging with a brilliance that could turn moons into dust. But the enemy fleet was evasive, slipping through the fire as though they were shadows. The shots that struck their hulls had no effect. Like the light of the Emperor himself couldn't touch them. In the bowels of the ship, the sailors manned their stations with increasing urgency. Engineer Talos's hands flew over the reactor controls, ensuring the ship's power systems were at full capacity, ready to push the Exemplar to the brink if necessary. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the understanding of what was at stake. These were not just Xenos. These were something else, something older. The battle raged for hours, with both sides locked in a deadly dance. The Imperial Navy's weapons, tested and true, were having little effect on the enemy. The fleet's best efforts were absorbed by the enemy's eerie, shadow-like hulls. Even the skilled pilots of the Imperial Navy's fighter squadrons found themselves lost in the vast emptiness of space, unable to land a decisive blow. Lieutenant Bellis stood frozen at her station, her fingers trembling over the tactical display. "It's not possible," she muttered. "We can't get through to them. There's nothing left, nothing we can target. They're blending with the void." It was then, as the hours stretched on, that the true scale of the threat became apparent. These weren't mere invaders. They were something else entirely. A horror that knew how to fight in the realm of the stars, where light and darkness clashed in endless battles. The Exemplar was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. The Navy's greatest asset, its knowledge, its discipline, its centuries of experience, had become a liability. In this new battlefield, there was no place for conventional warfare. In the shadowy vastness of space, the enemy had the advantage. "Commodore, we need to withdraw. We can't fight them in this manner," Bellis finally said, her voice low, yet desperate. "If we stay, we'll be destroyed." Caelen stood in silence for a moment. His mind raced. This was not a battle for honor or glory. This was a battle for the very survival of the fleet. A retreat was the only choice. "Prepare to retreat," Caelen ordered, his voice unyielding. "Signal the fleet. We leave now, or we die here." As the Exemplar turned, the enemy did not follow. They didn't need to. Their threat had already been made clear. They were not just a force of destruction. They were a reminder. A reminder that in the infinite void of space, humanity was not alone, and the unknown would always be there, waiting. The retreat was swift. the Exemplar and the other ships of the fleet breaking formation and speeding toward safer space. But the sense of victory was hollow. The enemy had not been vanquished. They had only been momentarily evaded. For the first time in the careers of those aboard, the truth was undeniable. Humanity was not the dominant force in the galaxy. The Exemplar's engines roared in defiance of the silence that threatened to swallow them whole, but even the hum of the ship felt like a weak attempt to stave off the vast, crushing pressure of the unknown. Commodore Caelen stood at the forward command station, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead, his mind still wrestling with the impossibility of what they had faced. He had led many battles in his career, each one fought with the full confidence of the Navy's superiority. But what had transpired here was beyond comprehension. The enemy, whatever they were, had shattered the very foundation of everything they believed in. The Exemplar was the mightiest of ships, a fortress of steel and firepower, yet it had been powerless against a threat that seemed to exist in the void itself. Caelen's mind lingered on the brief glimpses of the enemy fleet. Their movements had been too deliberate, too unnatural. They had seemed like extensions of the very space they occupied, as if the enemy were born from the darkness itself, designed to fade in and out of existence without leaving a trace. There was no visible crew, no command deck to target, no weapons fire to return. They were nothing more than the empty space between the stars, a void that devoured all that came near. "Commodore," Bellis called from behind him, her voice tinged with an uncertainty Caelen had never heard before. "I've been analyzing the data from the engagement. There's something that doesn't make sense." "What is it, Lieutenant?" Caelen asked, his tone sharp but weary. He had grown accustomed to the usual reports, but this was different. This was more than a report. "Their energy signatures. They don't register like anything we know. They're not using any conventional methods of propulsion. It's as if they're bending space itself. I can't make sense of it." Bellis paused, her fingers dancing across the tactical display. "And there's something else, a strange fluctuation in the warp field. It's faint, but it's there." Caelen frowned. The warp, the very fabric of reality twisted and bent by the unnatural forces of the Imperium. It had been the domain of the Chaos Gods and their followers, a place where time and space lost all meaning. But this was different. These enemies had nothing to do with the chaos that the Imperium knew. This was something entirely new. "Keep monitoring it," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "Report back to me immediately if anything changes." There was a pause as Bellis turned back to her console, her brow furrowed in concentration. The Commodore knew what she wasn't saying. The implications of this were too dangerous to put into words. The Navy had always fought against the material forces of the galaxy, the orcs, the Tyranids, the Necrons. But this was an entirely different kind of war. This was a war against something that didn't play by the rules, something that lived in the very fabric of the universe. As the Exemplar and its fleet moved further from the battle, the tension aboard the ship remained thick. The crew had seen the retreat as the only option, but the unease lingered in every corner. What had happened in that engagement wasn't just another battle. It was a harbinger. The unknown enemy was not a one-time threat. They were a warning. The galaxy was vast, and humanity was not its sole occupant. That knowledge, once merely a theoretical concern, had now become a brutal reality. In the barracks, the soldiers stood in silence, their faces etched with the shock of the battle. Sergeant Solvay paced between the rows of soldiers, trying to make sense of it all. He had seen the tides of war before, the Xenos, the insurrectionists, the heretics. He had fought on battlefields where the line between life and death was drawn in blood. But this was something different. This was something that could not be defeated by sheer force. "Keep your heads up," Solvay muttered to his squad, his voice thick with both frustration and a quiet sense of fear. "We've fought enemies before. We've won, and we'll win again. But you need to remember, this isn't the same. We can't fight what we don't understand." He paused in front of his most experienced soldier, Corporal Fedorov, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the scars of countless battles. Fedorov met his gaze with a level of understanding that spoke volumes. They had both seen how wars unfolded, how they were won and lost. But this war, this new enemy, was unlike any they had faced before. "We'll fight, Sergeant," Fedorov said quietly, his voice steady. "But we need to learn. We need to know what we're dealing with." That thought echoed in the minds of every soldier, every officer, every member of the Imperial Navy. They could no longer rely on their conventional tactics, their centuries of experience in war. They needed to adapt, to evolve, to understand an enemy that defied the very laws of nature. The enemy's mastery over space, their ability to blend into the void itself, was beyond anything they had prepared for. As the Exemplar continued its retreat, the crew looked to the future with a sense of foreboding. They were no longer just defending the Imperium from Xenos invaders or heretics. They were facing something older, something darker. And as they ventured deeper into the unknown, the question lingered in the back of every mind. Was this the beginning of the end? The Exemplar sailed further into the blackness, its retreat a quiet acknowledgement of the true scope of the threat they faced. Yet even as the crew sought solace in the safety of distance, a new unease began to creep across the ship. Whispers, unspoken but felt, passed through the corridors, laced with a fear that had no clear origin. The horrors of the battle were still fresh in their minds, but it was something else, something within the crew itself that now gnawed at the edges of their consciousness. Something insidious. The Imperial Navy had always been a bastion of order, of loyalty to the Emperor. The officers were bound by duty, their resolve unwavering, their loyalty unquestioned. But with the return from the brink of annihilation, with the specter of a new, unknowable enemy looming on the horizon, cracks had begun to appear, not in the walls of the ship, but in the hearts of those who commanded it. The first to feel it was Lieutenant Bellis, the ship's tactical officer. She had spent countless hours poring over the enemy data, seeking patterns, trying to find some way to make sense of the inexplicable. But the more she looked, the more she found herself questioning the very systems that had defined her life. The data slate in front of her seemed to blur, the figures and numbers too perfect, too clean. And then there was the brief moment of doubt, the tiny, nagging suspicion that perhaps the Emperor's light had not illuminated everything. Could the warp have a hand in this? Could there be something more sinister at play, something within the Navy itself, hidden in plain sight? Bellis shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. It was not possible. She had seen too much, fought too many battles to let a whisper of doubt find a foothold. Yet the question lingered, growing stronger with each passing moment. Was there a connection between the strange behavior of the enemy and the rising tensions among the crew? Were these two forces, the unknowable Xenos and the increasingly fractured unity of the ship, linked in some dark, hidden way? The whispers spread like wildfire through the ship's lower decks. The familiar camaraderie of the crew had begun to fray. As soldiers and officers alike passed each other in the narrow, dimly lit hallways, there was a tension that had never been there before. It was subtle at first, an exchanged glance, a shift in posture. But it was there, and it was growing. Sergeant Solvay noticed it in his squad. There was something off about the way his men spoke now, something far removed from the unity that had been their hallmark. "They say there are whispers among the officers," Fedorov said one evening, his voice low as he leaned in toward Solvay. "Some believe we've been marked by the enemy, that they didn't just attack us, they chose us, picked us out, and now they're watching us." Solvay scoffed, trying to laugh off the comment, but there was something about Fedorov's tone that stopped him. "That's superstition, Corporal. We've faced far worse." "I'm not so sure," Fedorov muttered, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "There's been talk of strange dreams among the crew, men waking up, sweating, talking in tongues. Others have been seen muttering to themselves, saying things about the dark in the warp." He paused, his eyes flickering with something unsettling. "And then there's the talk about Commander Urian." Solvay's stomach dropped at the mention of Urian's name. The commander of the Exemplar's vanguard, Urian had always been a model of discipline and loyalty. His reputation was unblemished, his faith in the Emperor unshakable. But even Solvay couldn't deny that in recent days, Urian had been acting differently, more distant, more secretive. There had been rumors about his late-night meetings with some of the other officers, meetings that no one could confirm or explain. "Don't be foolish," Solvay said sharply, shaking his head. "Commander Urian has been loyal to the Emperor since before I was born. We've all been on edge since the battle, that's all." But the words felt hollow even to him. The air had thickened, as though something was pressing against the ship, trying to seep inside. In the mess hall, the mood had shifted. What once had been a place of shared stories and laughter now seemed like a room filled with strangers, each one lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The familiar chatter had faded, replaced by quiet conversations and lingering glances. One evening, Bellis overheard a conversation between two of the crewmen, their voices low but urgent. "Do you think the enemy knew we were coming?" one of them asked, his tone half-whispered. "What do you mean?" the other replied. "I mean," the first man said, glancing nervously around the room, "how could they be so prepared? How could they move like that, so silent and deadly, unless they knew everything about us? What if they've been watching us for years?" The second man laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "Don't be a fool. It's just the warp playing tricks on your mind. We've faced worse than this." But the first man wasn't convinced. "I don't know. I've heard things, strange rumors, things about some of the higher-ups." The conversation trailed off as a pair of officers passed by, their sharp glances silencing any further talk. Bellis stood there, her thoughts racing. The crew's unease was growing into something more dangerous, something deeper. The whispers that had begun in the shadows were starting to echo through every hallway. There were those who spoke of a new, insidious influence aboard the Exemplar, an influence that was not simply the fear of the unknown enemy, but something that went further, something internal. It was a heresy that grew from within, festering in the hearts of the men and women sworn to protect the Imperium. The whispers grew louder, more fervent, and the more Bellis heard, the more she feared the truth. What if the enemy wasn't just out there, in the void, waiting for them? What if the real danger was already aboard, hidden among the crew, and the only thing keeping it at bay was the loyalty they still held for the Emperor? The first sign was so small that most would have missed it. A prayer stick in the void shrine outside the astropathic sanctum, burned halfway and then quenched as if a sudden breath had smothered the ember. The wax beneath it had run in uneven rivulets, a frozen cascade that looked like fingers clawing down the brass-lit alcove. Bellis paused there longer than she meant to, listening to the soft chime of sensor chains beyond the hatch and the thin, keening harmonics that always seeped from the choir pit when the astropaths sank into sanctioned trance. She told herself she'd come to verify signal latency reports, to cross-check timestamps against the fleet's last relay from Segmentum Command. Yet the truth was simpler and far more human. She wanted the quiet. The quiet wasn't there. It had a hairline crack running through it, a dissonant note, as though one voice in the hidden choir held a breath a heartbeat too long before exhaling the Emperor's name. She marked the variance on her data slate and told herself it was nothing. The data disagreed. Chief Engineer Hirodule Kier, iron braids clattering with every movement, received her in the reactor vestry with the solemn gravity of a sermon. He spoke through a vox grill washed in incense smoke, Binharic cant underlaying his high Gothic, as if two choirs sang together out of time. There had been transient spikes in the plasma regulators during the retreat, he said, not dangerous in themselves, but threaded with patterns he did not like. Not wrong, for a tech priest did not blaspheme lightly, merely unblessed by precedent. The machine spirits accepted his litanies, the unguents soothed their temper, yet a residue of disharmony clung to the readouts, the way promethium soot clings to a manufactorum's lungs. He showed Bellis a pale waterfall of figures cascading down her slate, nested ratios, oscillations in the Geller field harmonics smoothed by the Exemplar's sanctified coil arrays. She understood enough to ask the only question that mattered. Could scrap code be riding the wake? Kier's mechadendrites stiffened an imperceptible fraction, like a beast scenting storm. It was possible, he conceded, and then he wrapped the possibility in a bulwark of caveats, prayers, and professional pride. Possible did not mean proven, and blasphemous predictions can conjure their own shadows. He would intensify the rites, he would scour, he would listen. On the gun decks, the armsmen drilled until sweat slicked the leather of their grips, and the smell of oil hung thick as a curtain. Solvay kept his voice even, his cadence measured, as if rhythm alone could stitch cohesion back into a company that wanted to fray. He changed the patterns without warning, reversed hand signals, ordered bayonets fixed and unfixed, locked and cleared, until muscle memory reasserted itself over rumor. Between evolutions, he called Fedorov forward, checked the veteran's stance, said nothing about the hesitations he did not want to admit he saw. Discipline is a dam against fear. He piled sandbag on sandbag and prayed the river would not rise. In the brief recess, a younger rating muttered a name too softly to be a report and too loudly to be a thought. Urian. Solvay's jaw tightened. The commander of the vanguard had not slept in the precincts anyone could confirm. He moved now like a knife carried in a sleeve. Present, legal, sharp, and somehow not accounted for when one tallied the silverware. Commodore Caelen convened a closed council in the chart room, where the star maps shone like drowned constellations beneath a pane of armored glass. The door seals whispered. Oaths were spoken, the old kind that taste of iron on the tongue. Bellis presented her anomalies without flourish. Kier intoned his lacunae, and the master of whispers, a lean, ash-voiced woman named Vereen, who had once failed to die on a black ship, set a thin folio on the table and opened it to show 3 crew dossiers. The first was a Vox adept who had begun to request double shifts near the choir pit, citing the need to keep the notes true. The second was an ordnance artificer who had swapped incense blends without sanction, claiming the old recipe made the machine spirits sleepy. The third was a junior lieutenant who had set his personal Aquila upside down in his locker, explaining when questioned that he was testing the hinge. None crimes, each a pebble. Together perhaps the first slide of earth before a hillside moves. Caelen did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke of storms and umbrellas because metaphors go down easier than blood. Measures would be taken. The Arbite's detachment aboard would audit the arms vault and shrines for unsanctioned icons. The Mechanicus would scrub the cogitator stacks to bedrock, and Vereen's silent network would shadow Commander Urian without insult or accusation. They would act with the delicacy due to loyal servants under strain. They would act with the ruthlessness due to a warship in peril. He finished with a truth that cannot be sweetened. Rumors are blades. If you let them lie about the table long enough, someone will pick one up. That night cycle, the Exemplar shifted her tone, a change so fine you would have to live inside her to hear it. Those who did felt it in their teeth. The Geller harmonics sighed, then steadied, then sighed again, as if a sleeper rolled against a fractured rib. In the gallery deck, a shrine keeper found a strip of parchment pinned under a prayer votive. The low Gothic hand was neat, the words patient. Beware the charts. He brought it to Bellis because he feared anyone else would laugh. She did not laugh. She followed him back along the bronze plates to the shrine and measured the votive's alignment with the brass inlay on the deck. The line of sight ran true to the chart room's forward bulkhead. She tasted copper, the way some do when storms walk over the skin of a ship. When she reached the chart room, Urian was already there. He stood without touching the glass, his reflection a ghost laid over a star field. For a moment, neither spoke. In the silence, she heard the faint rasp of incense grit under his boot. He noticed her noticing. A thin smile, pale as a switchblade, touched his mouth and was gone. He asked about the retreat with a politeness that felt like a test, and then, as if remembering a detail from an old catechism, he asked whether she had ever seen a map that did not lie. Bellis answered with doctrine. Maps abstract, men decide. Urian's eyes held the cold of a wardroom window at apogee. Then he asked whether she had ever considered that an enemy might draw the map for them. The bridge alarms did not howl so much as bloom, a layered flower of tones that lifted every head on the ship at once. Bellis moved before thought, out of the chart room, along the corridor where the deck seemed to tilt half a degree under her boots. Urian did not follow. On the main hololithic, a ripple ran through space like silk drawn across a blade. Geller harmonics dipped. The choir fluted a note that was not any human note at all, and Kyr's Binharic burst cracked like distant thunder over the command net. Caelen leaned forward into the storm gathering in the screens, his hands light on the rail, as if anything heavy would break it. The void outside had changed without moving. The enemy had not returned. Something else had. Or perhaps it had always been there, and now chose to show its edge. Chapter 5. The Last Stand. The Exemplar trembled under the weight of the void. Every inch of the ship seemed alive with an electric tension, humming and pulsing in response to the unknown that now approached. Outside the massive, reinforced hull, the stars flickered and the blackness deepened. But it wasn't the vastness of space that commanded attention. It was the feeling of something encroaching, a presence that seemed to fold in on the edges of reality. This was not simply the threat of battle, but the realization that the Exemplar was facing something that could not be confronted by mere firepower, strategy, or even loyalty to the Emperor. The Exemplar was positioned at the edge of an unseen precipice, and it was not alone. The enemy, whatever it was, had stopped hiding. Now it loomed directly ahead, waiting in the silence, an unknown terror. There were no communications, no demands, no grand declarations, just the cold certainty that the enemy had arrived, not to negotiate or to destroy, but to observe, perhaps to judge. Commodore Caelen stood at the bridge, his every breath slow and deliberate. The time for retreat had passed. The time for questioning what was real or what was false had vanished with the first ripple of their arrival. He had commanded fleets before, faced down the monstrous, the heretical, and the alien. But this was something that defied all understanding. It was not the enemy they had fought, not the foe they had expected, but something else entirely. It was as if space itself had become a battlefield, unfathomable and warped, an arena where the rules no longer applied. Lieutenant Bellis. Caelen's voice was steady, his eyes fixed on the swirling patterns on the star map. Report, what is their position? Bellis, her eyes wide with disbelief, kept glancing between the various sensor readings, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before her. They're not moving in the way we would expect. They bend the very fabric of space. Every time I try to focus on their exact position, they shift slightly, just enough to stay out of the fleet's weapon range. It's as if they are aware of us. Caelen's mind raced, but his face remained neutral. The enemy was not just hiding or preparing for an ambush. It was playing a game with them, manipulating their every move. This was no mere tactical advantage. It was as though they were being toyed with. The bridge fell silent as Caelen took in the full scope of their situation. The fleet had been split into smaller units, each of them holding position on the outskirts of the unknown formation, awaiting orders to engage. But no order could come, not until they understood what they were facing. Every command was an echo in the dark. Every move they made was anticipated. They were trapped in a web, one that they could not see. Without warning, the Exemplar lurched violently. The shockwave rattled through the ship like a thunderclap, throwing Bellis off balance and causing the crew to stumble. The The screech of alarms filled the bridge as the external sensors flickered erratically. Through the viewport, the stars themselves seemed to distort, as though reality was warping at the edges. "Report!" Caelen barked. "Shields are holding," Bellis replied, her voice tense. But something just ripped through our sensor grid. It's like they're tearing at the fabric of the ship itself. The Commodore gripped the edge of the rail, his knuckles whitening. What in the Emperor's name are we facing? Bellis's eyes darted to the tactical map again, where the enemy ships had, without warning, seemed to dissolve into the ether. One moment they were there, ominous and massive, their forms unrecognizable and terrifying. The next, they were gone, vanished. Just a subtle, imperceptible shift in the space around them. No sensors, no targeting systems, no systems of any kind could track them. "Impossible," Bellis muttered under her breath. "They're slipping through the warp itself. It's not just their ships, it's them. The entire fleet is now moving through the fabric of reality like we are. They're a part of the void." Caelen's mind reeled at the implications. The enemy was not just using the warp to travel, they were becoming it. Like phantoms, they existed and did not at the same time. They were an anomaly, something beyond the limits of Imperial understanding. They were the living essence of everything the Imperium feared. "Get our fleets to reform," Caelen ordered with a calm that felt forced. "Tell them to brace for an ambush. We will fight, and we will stand firm. The Emperor will watch over us." Yet, deep down, Caelen knew this would not be a battle for victory. The battle was now about survival. The Exemplar was one of the finest ships in the fleet, but even it could not stand against an enemy that defied the laws of space and time. They were being led into a trap. There was no escape. The ship jolted again, this time more violently. Crew members scrambled to secure themselves, the bridge's bulkheads groaning under the strain. A series of high-pitched warnings shrieked from every corner of the ship. A voice crackled across the comms. "Commodore, this is Engineer Keir. The Geller field is beginning to fluctuate. The warp's influence is growing. We might lose the barrier soon, sir. If it fails, the ship will be vulnerable." Caelen's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. If the Geller field went down, the Exemplar would be nothing more than a husk, exposed to the full horrors of the warp. There would be no escape from the nightmarish creatures that lurked there, no salvation from the grasping, unseen fingers that would tear the ship apart. The enemy was no longer just an invading force. They were a manifestation of the galaxy's darkest truths. The Exemplar was standing at the threshold of oblivion, and there was no force in the Imperium that could hold the line against such a thing. "Prepare to abandon ship," Caelen said quietly. It was not a surrender, it was survival. "If the Geller field fails, we retreat into the warp. We'll make it to the nearest system. We have to." As the crew scrambled to execute the order, the stars outside the viewport shimmered once more, and the enemy appeared again, slipping from the void like a shadow in a storm. Caelen's grip on the rail tightened. They had no choice now but to face this enemy head-on. It was either that or succumb to the darkness. The final stand had begun. The tension aboard the Exemplar was suffocating. Even as the crew moved to execute their orders, the weight of what was unfolding pressed down upon them like the crushing depths of the ocean. The Geller field was the last line of defense between them and the unspeakable horrors of the warp. If it failed, they would be torn apart by the very fabric of reality. Caelen felt the weight of that truth settle heavily in his chest. There would be no retreat, no more orders to be given. It was time for action. "Ready the escape pods," Caelen ordered, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Activate all emergency protocols. If the Geller field collapses, we will need every moment." Bellis moved swiftly, her fingers dancing across the control panels as she communicated with the rest of the fleet. The fleet was regrouping, forming tight, defensive clusters, their gun batteries primed and their shields strengthened. But it was clear that they were no match for the force bearing down on them. The enemy had once again slipped into the fabric of the universe like a shadow in the dark, an enemy that could not be fought with conventional weapons, strategy, or tactics. This was not a battle to be won. It was a battle to survive. In the reactor bay, Kier's voice crackled over the Vox, his words distorted by the strain of the ship's systems. "Commodore, the Geller field is under duress. We're doing everything we can, but if it fails, we'll be exposed to the warp's full wrath. It won't be quick, but it will be certain." The tech priest's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it now, a sense of finality. The same finality that filled the entire ship. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive long enough to escape, long enough to have a chance. On the gun deck, Solvay's soldiers worked in a frenzy. The barracks were chaotic, their usual routine forgotten in the face of an enemy that could not be confronted. Solvay barked orders to his men, their faces grim, their hands steady as they loaded ammunition and checked their weapons. They were ready for battle, but the truth gnawed at them. They were preparing for a fight they would likely lose. "There will be no glory in this fight," Solvay muttered under his breath, his voice low. "This is just survival. We do our duty, and we do it until the end." The soldiers did not reply. They didn't need to. The words were understood. They had all seen battles before, but never like this. The very universe itself was shifting, warping around them, as if some unseen force had set the laws of reality against them. The enemy was not just a fleet. It was a force that reshaped the world as they knew it. The Exemplar was a ship built for war, a bastion in the void, but even it was starting to feel the strain. The walls groaned as if they, too, were under attack. The lights flickered, and the steady hum of the engines began to falter, a sound that sent a chill through the crew. Every system aboard the ship seemed to be failing in slow, steady succession, and with it, their time was running out. The ships in the fleet were holding position, but their screens, their weapons, their very sensors were faltering in the face of this enemy. Whatever they were, they had proven that no weapon, no technology could stop them. Commodore Caelen moved to the viewport once again, looking out into the void. The stars seemed dimmer now, flickering erratically, as if they, too, were uncertain of their place in the galaxy. The enemy ships were a constant presence at the edge of their sensor range, shifting in and out of visibility, their positions unpredictable. Each time they moved, the Exemplar shook again, as if something in the ship itself was being pulled towards the center of the storm. "They're toying with us," Bellis said, her voice laced with frustration. "They know they can break us, and they're waiting. We're nothing but a puzzle for them to solve." Caelen turned, his gaze intense. We are not a puzzle. We are a line in the sand. If they want us to break, they will have to break us themselves." He turned away from the viewport, his hands clenched into fists at his side. "All hands, prepare for final engagement," he ordered. "We will not flee. We will not bend. The Emperor's light will find a way, even in the darkest of times. This is our fight, and we will face it with every ounce of strength we have left." The crew moved with purpose. Bellis ran through the final communications with the fleet, sending one last signal to the other ships. Solvay's soldiers took their positions, their faces set with the grim determination of men who knew they would not see another day. The Exemplar began to turn, its massive guns aligning with the void, the weapons primed for one last assault. As the enemy closed in, Caelen's thoughts raced. His mind flickered briefly to his home, to the worlds he had once known, to the men and women he had fought beside throughout his career. They would not die in vain. If this was to be the end of the Exemplar, then it would be on their terms. They would face their fate with honor, as soldiers of the Emperor. And then, with a suddenness that sent a shock wave through the command deck, the enemy attacked. They had been waiting, biding their time, watching as the Imperial Navy held its position. Now, they surged forward, faster than anything the Exemplar had encountered before. Their ships tore through the void like phantoms, appearing and vanishing with unnatural speed. Caelen's hand shot out, and the Exemplar's weapons roared to life, massive blasts of energy filling the void. The Exemplar fired everything it had: torpedoes, plasma lances, lascannons, all of it unleashed in a desperate bid to hold the line. The enemy retaliated in kind, their ships releasing beams of destructive energy that tore into the Exemplar's hull. The ship groaned under the strain, the metal screaming as it was rent asunder by the invisible force of the enemy's power. In the command center, Caelen's voice was barely audible over the deafening roar of battle. Hold the line." The crew held fast, fighting to the bitter end, even as the Exemplar's shields flickered and failed, and the hull began to buckle under the constant barrage. The battle was lost, but the Exemplar would not surrender. The crew would not give in, not while there was breath left in their bodies. In the final moments, the enemy closed in, their forms shifting through the stars like specters. The Exemplar was not broken yet, but it was no longer a ship of war. It was a dying star, burning brighter with every passing moment, defiant until the very end. The battle had turned into a storm. The Exemplar was no longer a vessel of the Imperium. It was a monument to the final moments of defiance. The enemy, relentless and silent, seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality itself, attacking from all angles, appearing and vanishing with unnatural precision. The Exemplar, battered and broken, fired its last volleys into the black, the cannon fire lighting up the void like a desperate flare. But even in the light of their final resistance, it was clear. This battle was over. The crew fought not out of hope, but out of duty. They stood firm, locked in the embrace of a ship that would never surrender, no matter how much the stars seemed to mock them. Caelen's commands were a steady drumbeat in the chaos, urging his officers to hold their stations and to continue fighting. But in his heart, he knew the truth. The Exemplar had been a symbol, a fortress, and now it was a dying star. But it was still burning. Sergeant Solvay's soldiers had already seen the truth in the steel of their rifles. Each of them knew what it meant to fight for something beyond survival. As their ship creaked and groaned, the lower decks became a battlefield of its own. Each shot fired, each soldier fallen, was a testament to the last shred of humanity that refused to bend. The armsmen fought with the fierce loyalty only the Imperium could demand, without hesitation, without fear. They were soldiers to the end, and they would face whatever came with the Emperor's name on their lips. The ship trembled again as an enemy strike rocked the hull, and the emergency alarms wailed with an urgency that seemed almost mocking in its failure to halt the inevitable. The Geller field, already strained, finally failed, tearing a hole in the protective barrier that separated them from the madness of the warp. For a brief, terrible moment, the stars outside seemed to bleed into something darker, something twisted. The crew, the ship, everything they had worked to preserve. It was all collapsing into the cold void, to be swallowed by the abyss. But still, Caelen remained at his post, his eyes filled with the fire of a man who had nothing left to lose, fixed on the final moments of the Exemplar. There would be no retreat, no surrender. He would fight until the very last breath. As the enemy closed in, Caelen's final command echoed across the ship. For the Emperor, for humanity, we will not fall. And in that last stand, that last cry into the void, the Exemplar fired its final shots. The guns roared one last time, the ship shaking as if it, too, was screaming into the endless night. The Exemplar would not go quietly. It would burn brightly until its very last spark of light was extinguished. The enemy, whoever they were, would not have the honor of a quiet victory. They would have to carve the ship's final moments into the history of a war unlike any other. And as the Exemplar was torn asunder, its crew's final fight waged in every corner, in every fire and every broken cry, the light of the Imperium flared one last time, a defiant beacon in the heart of the dark. They had stood, not as soldiers of a dying empire, but as the last bulwark of humanity against a universe that had grown cold and indifferent. The stars might have swallowed them, but they would not be forgotten. This was the end. The final stand of the Exemplar, the unyielding light of the Imperium, the shadow of the unknown, had passed through them like a storm. But in their hearts, they knew the truth. The Emperor would find a way to carry them forward, even through the darkness.